Okay, and I'll just pull my little handy dandy Zoom thing so I can just monitor the chat. And I'm going to share screen. Okay, so really quickly for today, I just kind of wanted to take inventory on some stuff. I did want to talk briefly about Project 3, just kind of take status of where you guys all are at, maybe answer some questions, because I know there's been a lot of confusion, particularly around like the labels and sort of feature generation. So that's not great. Okay, sorry about the mic echo. So I did want to sort of make sure we could talk at least a little bit about that, and then pivot over, talk about careers. So so firstly, I know Professor released grades on CCLE last night. The reason she did it on CCLE was she applied a curve to it. So, but we're going to be also releasing the raw grades on Gradescope. So chances are the grade that you see on Gradescope will be different than the grade you see on CCLE. The grade on CCLE is your actual grade. Your Gradescope grade will be your raw score, your pre-curved score. And then, yeah, we're going to try I'm going to try to release some statistics on that, just mean, median, standard deviation, things like that. We're also going to open up via Gradescope for regrade requests. There'll be an announcement going out about this, but it'll be, I think you're going to have the weekend to submit regrade requests, and so that they can be processed early next week. And then, of course, obviously, bear in mind, last thing you got to do for the course is just Project 3. That's going to be due in 1 week. So within 1 week, Thursday, March 18th. Hopefully, you guys have at least started looking at the data, started poking around, started working on that. Again, we're going to just kind of do a check-in, see where you guys are at with all that. But yeah, just kind of that's sort of the last thing to get across the finish line. And so I did want to take some time today and just make sure you were all feeling good and kind of well equipped and moving forward with that. Okay, black tie discussion. Just kind of want to open it up. Anybody show up? Doesn't have to be much, but we are doing best dressed. If anybody's ready to rock something. Oh, sadness. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, if you guys want to like do it in the background, I'm going to check back with you at the end of discussion. So remember, there will be prizes for best dressed. So clearly the competition is not exactly fierce today. So if your chances of winning are quite high with relatively minimal effort. So let's see. Okay, then there's a question about the Professor design curve of the course is just about. So the overall course will be curved as well. I think we're going to kind of wait until we get all the grades in for the last project and homework. There will be a curve applied to that as well, just based on performance. So the exam itself was curved, and then the course overall will be curved as well. Okay, so project 3 review. So again, I did kind of want to pause here, maybe sort of take some inventory on things. I know there was some unfortunate confusion about the labeling and about some of the features. So I did kind of want to just take stock on that and, just make sure everybody was sort of on the same page with that. But so the first thing to note is, and by the way, kudos to you all, because multiple people reached out with this. Kudos to you guys for sort of doing the deep dive on the data and kind of recognizing that there was a problem specifically with the loads feature. And I mentioned in that announcement yesterday, right? Number one rule of data science: trust but verify. Just because a data dictionary tells you one thing doesn't mean that is in fact the case. Human error happens all across the spectrum, including in this project. And so as it turns out, loads was just loads carried that particular day. So it's not particularly good as an aggregate. A different feature, total loads, was the one that you actually wanted to use for generating your label. And so what you will want to do for your label generating exercise is take the 75th percentile for both most recent day and for total loads, and sort of use, so drivers that kind of meet both criteria will be labeled a 1 for a high performing driver, otherwise be labeled a 0. And that will be your label generating exercise. I also apologize. There was a lot of kind of junk features that kind of crept into the data. I had been doing a lot of sort of like preliminary work, like playing around with doing like date time conversions, playing around with doing some periodicity stuff, just doing some kind of test stuff. And a lot of that junk just ended up in the data. So I released kind of updated and cleaned data sets, hopefully, that are kind of good. So those are available on CCLE, same assignment page, but have now hopefully been updated. One other point that I wanted to clarify up front, and then I'll kind of just open it up and see if anyone has any questions. But I know there's been some confusion on the purpose of, you were given 2 data sets. You're given a training data set and a scoring data set. So the training data set is what you're going to use to build your model. That includes the features most recent date and total loads. So you'll use that to generate your labels, and you'll use that to then kind of build your predictive model. Your scoring data is sort of an additional 1,000 instances that don't include either of those 2 columns. They don't include most recent date, and they don't include total loads. And so the idea is that you would essentially kind of plug those into your model, do whatever feature, sort of data pipelining, apply it to your model, and use that to generate a series of predictions. So for those 1,000 instances, you will then export those predictions. It'll be sort of a 2-column table, and the instructions are on Kaggle, but you have like ID and then prediction. You upload that CSV file directly to Kaggle, and then Kaggle will score it based on a sort of a metric that we have. That's sort of an answer key that we've uploaded. And that will be your competition score. So that's what you would use the scoring data for as well. And again, as noted, getting full credit for this project does not require that you score particularly well on the project. However, scoring well on the contest will unlock bonus points for you. And so we do not have some specific sort of thresholds for that, but generally speaking, if you have a high performing model, something that could be used in a production environment for next trucking, you would sort of be looking at bonus points for it. So yeah, so again, okay, so let me see, there's some questions about this. So going from the bottom, so yeah, so for Kaggle, you only upload 1 CSV file, correct? So your submissions will be as follows. You're going to upload a contest entry to Kaggle, which is just the CSV file. There's no code that's going to be uploaded to Kaggle. And then on Gradescope, it'll be just like you did for the previous 2 projects. Assuming you worked in Jupyter Notebooks, you're going to export your notebook as a PDF. You're going to upload that. And then separately, you're going to upload your report. I think those are 2 separate uploads for you. Yeah, and again, so to confirm, you will be using total loads, not loads, correct? Loads just gives you the amount of loads that are serviced that day by that individual. So, if that individual is working and then happens to take multiple loads, that'll show up under the loads column, but it's not a cumulative score. It's just for that particular day. Total loads is an aggregate score. So you want to use total loads for your feature. And again, I apologize for the confusion about that. The data dictionary that was given us and some sort of initial conversations with Fiona, we thought that those fields were interchangeable, but some of you guys did some awesome sleuthing and kind of realized that no, that wasn't the case. And we went back, we confirmed indeed you were correct, and sort of had to update it accordingly. But yeah, I apologize for that. So let's see, other questions specifically on the project. So there's a good question here about whether it's allowed or not allowed to aggregate loads. The short answer is it is allowed. If you're given the data, you're allowed to use it. There's no restrictions on what you do with the data that you're given. And one of the biggest things too, and I kind of posted about this on Piazza, but I wanted to make sure that you guys were tracking on this as well. But I think one of the challenges with this project in particular is that there is that mismatch between the model that you're being asked to build and the data that you're being given to build it. And again, the model that we're asking you to build is fundamentally, we want you to build a predictive model for drivers. You want to be able to classify whether or not a driver is high performing or not. But the data that you're given is episodic. It's every kind of business activity that occurs on the platform that's being tracked, along with some biographical information for the driver themselves that sort of accompanies it. And so the result is you have this scenario in which you have a one-to-many data reference point where you can have one driver having multiple entries if they have worked multiple projects in your data. So the kind of the challenge that you have for this is how you want to approach that. And there's really two ways you can go about this. And this is kind of what I mentioned. The first is just kind of ignore the fact that there's a one-to-many. Just kind of treat every driver as their own unique driving instance and just kind of build the classifier around that. That's not best practices, and that will probably kind of reduce the impact of some of your other kind of driver biographical metrics if half the time they're not high performing and then suddenly they are high performing. But it's also not terrible, because the reality is with the data that we're given, these drivers, because we're looking at a performance threshold of, we want them to be in the 75th percentile in terms of total load serviced. We want them to be have activity within the 75th percentile of recency. So the reality is drivers, when they start out on the platform, will not be considered high performing. That will be something that they will earn over time. So it's not a great approach, but it's also not as terrible as it maybe seems at first blush. The second way of approaching this is essentially just aggregating up and saying, okay, well, let me trim all the duplicative entries. Let me just look at the most recent instance for each driver and just keep that data. And just keep sort of the most, because that the cumulative data in terms of most recent loads, in terms of total loads, all of that will be cumulative to that last entry. And among that, there is actually some really, really cool feature extraction that you could do prior to doing that. So, one of the things we were speculating about in office hours with Fiona is that there's some really cool work that you could do looking at the density and distribution of loads that they've done. If they've biased towards certain periodicities, if they've biased towards certain things, right? There's a lot of kind of potential data that you can kind of extract and filter up as a feature to then, before you kind of collapse your data into sort of one unique row per driver. So
question about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
When we eventually have to do the same for our score data set, are we allowed to have the score data set reference the train? Because some drivers in the score data set also appear in the train.
That's a really good question. And I'll be honest with you, I've been struggling with how to do that and how to handle that. What I want to tell you is that we're not going to put any restrictions on this. And I know that isn't technically good practice, leveraging your training data for your scoring, right? Typically it should just be your model and it should be a pure thing, but I kind of don't want to put any restrictions on you for that. So if you do, because it is the same driver IDs, and so there will be overlap between your scoring and your training data. If you do want to kind of try to like plug in that information and maybe update it, I'm gonna allow it. Now, the one thing that I will note though is that the labels that we generated for the scoring thing are based on those single instance things. So essentially we did the raw calculation thing. We did the take whatever that instance is, calculate, look at their most recent, look at their total loads, calculate a 1 or a 0 based on that. And the downside, if you go with that approach, is it's plausible that we took something earlier just with the random shuffle, and later on they did become high performing, but they just weren't when we generated the label. So that's the big downside of that approach or not. So do kind of be aware of that. But again, we don't want to put restrictions in terms of how you approach this. And in fact, we want to encourage you guys to be as experimental as possible. No, okay, so let me see. Okay, so there's a question of, yeah, so right now, Kaggle, so Kaggle puts in place a limitation. It limits you, I believe, to 2 submissions per day, just because they want to prevent people from gaming the system and uploading basically 1,000 different iterations of it and seeing what works. If that becomes problematic for you all, I think we can raise that limit, but just kind of let me know. But yeah, I think the limit is 2 per day. I think that's how it's set. And again, the idea there is just because you're submitting a CSV, they want to prevent people from just randomly generating CSV solutions and then uploading, blitzing the system, uploading every possible permutation and just seeing which one performs highest. So, but again, if that's a problem, we can definitely update that. I was hopeful we have given a formula for me. Okay, so let's see, and then there's a question from Drew again. Okay, so Drew, did we address the specific question around loads, or is that still something you want to talk through? Okay, cool. Okay, so any other questions on project 3? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Recent date. Yeah. I apologize for that. Recent date. It should not be in the clean data set that I just released. Recent date, just to give you guys background on it, I did a date time conversion, part of some of the analytics that I was doing. And so I generated that column internally, just so I can, because, when you input it, most recent date starts out as an object. And so, but you can do a date time conversion, and there's like a lot of interesting analytics you can run when it's in date time format. So I was running that. And then when I sort of exported your training data, I forgot to purge that column. So in the updated data I released last night, I should have purged that. But yeah, that was not originally in the data. But basically that was just a copy over of like the most recent date. And then I had just done a internal Python transformation. So yeah, so Mani, there's a good question about sort of most recent date being different from recent record for each driver. I don't actually have a good answer for that. I'm not sure if they're the same or not. I imagine they're similar, but that might be a question to ask Fiona, because there could be some non-load business activities, like maybe an application being approved or something like that, that would be recorded as an episodic thing, but wouldn't necessarily have a load associated with it. So that might be where a discrepancy would occur. Yeah. So again, if you're provided that data field, you don't have to handicap yourself. You can feel free to use that data as part of building your model. So, no need to kind of tie your own hands behind your back, because obviously that data would be very relevant to your label if it happens to overlap. So I think it's okay to keep it. Okay, anything else? All right, well, we'll table the project conversation now. I will open it up for questions at the end of discussion as well. So if you do have anything else, do let me know. I will make some time for it. So, all right, then let me see what else do I have. Okay, so yeah, so for our topic for today, let's talk careers. And I know we're sharing now. I know that most of you guys are, I believe, juniors or seniors when I looked at the roster. Just out of curiosity, like, how's the hunt for jobs, internships, like, how's that been going for you all? Like, y'all got that locked down, or some of you guys still working? Some of you. Okay, so I'm seeing a little bit of a mixed bag. Some of you knocked it out early. Some of you got an offer. Cool, awesome. Okay, so I guess to kind of give you a little bit of a background on this, and part of the inspiration for this kind of came with twofold. There are many virtues to UCLA, but career consulting is not one of them. They really just kind of leave you guys out in the woods on this one, and really don't provide you with any sort of career guidance advice. And the flip side of this, like, as I think a lot of you know, I have a very sort of, I guess, non-traditional arc with this. I graduated, went and got my master's, have worked in industry now for over a decade before going back to UCLA. So I've kind of been like deep enough in my career now that I was like where you were at early on in career, trying to sort of break out, trying to sort of land those initial positions, those initial internships, and now sort of being in the position where I'm actively fielding candidates and sort of getting to see kind of behind the scenes in terms of how that comes together. And just kind of thinking through, because there's a ton of websites and a ton of things out there, but like, what were some things that I don't necessarily see out there discussed, but I wish people would have told me? And that's kind of what I wanted to discuss with you guys today, is just things that in talking to people and things that I've kind of realized that have sort of been helpful for me, and hopefully could be a little helpful for you in terms of going through this process. And let's kind of just acknowledge up front that this is just not fun. Job hunting is never fun. It is a humbling, immiserating, and generally dejecting process. I mean, nothing will pop your ego faster than trying to apply for jobs. And the reality is, for better, for worse, it just kind of always sucks. There isn't, there's no kind of super secret method, no super awesome website or anything that just kind of like makes this process easy. But there are tricks, there are things that you can do, maybe to kind of improve the odds a little bit, maybe make things a little bit better for you. And again, those are kind of some things I wanted to talk to you about. Okay, quick poll. How many of you are vibing with that sentiment on the right? That I already applied to so many jobs without any luck that at this point I'm just mass applying to a ton of places, and I'm just going to, whoever gives me an offer, I have no standards. I am just throwing myself at it. Okay, yeah. So, and by the way, we are going to talk specifically leak code coming up when we talk about technical interviews and things like that. That's coming up. So yeah, so we're all vibing that, we're all feeling that. It is just the kitchen sink of things, right? You just toss everything down. You just kind of desperately hope to do this. Now, the right approach, or at least I should say maybe a slightly better approach in terms of long-term success and satisfaction, would be something that looks a little bit more like this, where after sort of understanding what you want to do after college, you've identified a handful of companies that you really want, you are able to sort of focus your efforts there, even while not necessarily closing the door to applying more widely. And I recognize that you're like, look, I've applied to 1,000 places. I can't, beggars can't be choosers. How on earth is this a valid approach? And I think we kind of want to talk through a little bit of that, but I want to kind of break this whole sentence down. The first thing we want to talk about is figuring out what you want to do after college, because again, that's not something really people spend a lot of time talking about or really even thinking about. And in terms of your long-term career satisfaction, it is hugely important, but nobody spends any time actually talking about what are the formulas for you to have sort of a successful job. And then talking about focusing your efforts. How does that really, really work? How do you kind of break through that, online job fair, just morass, and actually kind of break through and are able to kind of get those personal contacts that ultimately lead to more successful job hunting things. So we're going to kind of talk through exactly what that looks like. But again, oftentimes really sort of the most successful job hunting strategies will require generally investing more effort into some specific companies. So just as a starting point, let's kind of take a step back and understanding where you might really want to end up and targeting your efforts there. And to do that, I want you guys to kind of engage in a little bit of an exercise here. And again, I haven't seen this articulated anywhere, but from my experience, I have found that this is hugely, hugely impactful in terms of your own sort of well-being when you enter the workforce. Because I'm going to be real with you guys. I remember that feeling when when I sort of graduated with my master's and I started working and I was like clocking in the office, and you have this like moment of existential dread when you're like, oh my God, this is the next 40 years of my life. And that's kind of a rough realization to have. And, and recognizing whether or not you've landed in a space where you can thrive in or not is hugely important. And I'll be honest with you, it worked out well for me in a really kind of random way, but there was no reason why it should have. And I got incredibly lucky, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but I had no insights. I really, like everyone, I think almost all of you, I just kind of stumbled on to the best offer I got and just took it and didn't really have any kind of appreciation for whether or not it was really a good fit for me. And again, it happened to work out, but just as likely it could not have worked out. And so in thinking this through, I think there's sort of a couple ways in which you can kind of diagnose your own corporate personality, if you will. And so if I broke some of these out, the first being lone wolf or tribe. If you think about the environments that you sort of succeed in, do you generally enjoy sort of immersing yourself in organizations and cultures that are sort of all encompassing? When you read about companies like Facebook where they have those voluntary happy hours that aren't quite voluntary if you really want to, be seen as a team player, or, those company cultures where everybody is a family, right? If that's important to you, if you want to be in an environment like that, or would you be someone who would feel stifled by that and just want somewhere where you can kind of clock in, clock out, do your work, but you don't need to be wearing the swag. You don't need to be doing that, right? Again, it's kind of important to sort of recognize that and understand that there are companies like that. Another thing is odd one out or in the thick of things. This is kind of another one. You can kind of begin to gauge that yourself just based on who you like hanging out with and the kind of conversations you like enjoying with it. Generally, are you somebody who likes hanging out with other CS kids? Are you someone who likes kind of being in with a cohort, kind of working on the same stuff? Or do you sort of like being the odd one out, right? Do you prefer hanging out with the North Campus kids and finding out more about the stuff that they're doing and sort of being the only one in the room kind of with your particular skill set? Again, that's going to heavily influence the type of company where you might do well. And do you want to work for a traditional tech company, or maybe do you want to work for something not in tech, but where you would have a tech role? Something to consider. Rooted or uprooted. Again, a lot of people, thrive in different kind of working environments. And one of the biggest one is consistency. Are you somebody who likes to kind of go to, if you've got like your study spot, your space in the library, your thing that you just like, you like to go and you like to get work done, you like to sort of huddle around there? Or are you sort of more of like a nomadic type? You like to kind of float around libraries, coffee shops, whatever, like just kind of working anywhere that fits you, but you don't necessarily want to kind of clock in as much. Again, something to consider. Another thing that I think is deeply important in terms of your longer term career is going to be, sorry, my phone just did something weird. Okay, cancel. Another thing to consider is sinker or floater. And in terms of your problem solving capabilities, do you prefer, are you the kind of person who really loves to do a deep dive on a particular problem, spend weeks, months, just kind of mulling over something, really gaining particular skill set or expertise? Or are you the type of person who loves to dabble in a lot of things, who loves to try out different domains, different areas, different kind of problem sets, get some experience and exposure to them, but don't necessarily want to sort of become any kind of particular domain expert in it? By the way, my Wi-Fi is bugging out on my phone. Are you guys still able to hear me, or am I just talking into the void right now?
You're good.
Loud and clear.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right. Let's see. So in a similar vein, regimented or haphazard, I think this is very similar to the kind of work environment that you like. Are you the type of person who likes sort of clocking in, clocking out, having those nice 8 to 5 hours where you can kind of segment a really nice work-life balance, and when you're off the clock, you're off? Or are you somebody who embraces flexibility? Kind of similar to what you have with the college lifestyle, right? Where you'll maybe stay up till 2 or 3 a.m. working, but then you get to kind of just like sleep until 10. And again, just understanding kind of what you really kind of, what type of work setting works for you. And again, everybody's different with these things, and it's kind of fascinating how people react and respond to these things differently. Paved roads or trailblazing. This is another one, and this is from a management perspective, something that I had to learn the hard way, because I've always preferred trailblazing. I've always preferred being in an environment where I had minimal oversight, where I'd be given direction, but just kind of being allowed to go off and do my own thing. But and then I would sort of have people reporting to me, and I'd sort of apply that managerial style to them. And it turned out to be just an awful fit. Like they were really, really unhappy with them, because for them, it caused them an immense amount of anxiety, because they wanted clear expectations, clear guidelines. They wanted to have that roadmap to success. And as a manager, I didn't give that to them. And that was something that they just didn't respond well. And it was, for me, it was like a learning experience that, people thrive under different conditions. Excitement or chill. This is kind of another thing. Like, is it important to you that you be working in high stakes, high impact environments, where you're making a difference? Or do you just kind of want just a nice, calm, not stressful space where you can, again, just sort of do your work and not necessarily feel like you have to be in the thick of things? And very similar to that, another thing is sort of passion or indifference. Like, is it important to you that for the work that you do, you feel excited about, you feel engaged about it be meaningful work to you? Or are you very happy just kind of clocking in, doing the work, getting the paycheck, and then, and then clocking out? And to me, that kind of also feeds into something else of central versus secondary. Like, how important really is your job to you? Is this something that you imagine will be sort of a central focus to you? Is this something like when you talk to people, when you talk to your friends, is this something that drives you, that motivates you, and it's therefore important that you be in an environment where you feel like you're really making a difference? Or or again, do you feel like the locus of your life is outside of your job, right? You have passions, hobbies, traveling, music, whatever that like are your primary motivating drivers, and for you, the job should enable those. Not a right or a wrong answer, but I think it's important just for you to kind of internalize and figure those some of those questions out when you're sort of figuring out the types of corporate cultures where you would thrive in. And I know, let me pause here because I know that there were a couple questions here, and when I got disconnected, I lost them. But so yeah, so I think there was a question: is this something we were supposed to explore through internships? So the short answer is yes. You know, I don't expect you all to know these answers now, and one of the reasons why internships are so valuable is precisely because it does give you insights into the types of environments where you will thrive in. So yes, getting those internships are so valuable, not just because they're resume boosters, but precisely because it allows you to dip your toe into the water, try out these different environments, and does kind of give you a better sense of what sort of areas you would succeed. Let's see. So yeah, and in fact, you know, I had early career advisor that said the reality is it's very more often than not, your sort of career pathway is as much about figuring out what you don't want to do with your career as what you do. And that's very true. I mean, you will find very quickly that there are certain corporate environments, certain types of tasks, certain type of work that will just turn you off and alienate you. And it's important to recognize that and steer clear of those. Okay, so there's a question about working experience different between grad students and undergrads. So Ricky, are you asking in terms of grad school, or are you asking in terms of jobs that undergrads versus grads would be getting?
I'd be talking about like the jobs you get in terms of like if you were say like a PhD grad, you'd probably be like a data scientist as opposed to just like a software engineer or something like that.
Yeah.
So I imagine there are some differences, but in terms of like just day to day, are there any major ones?
Yeah. Okay. So really good question. So, you know, let's talk specific to CS. I think one of the interesting things about CS is, and, you know, good news for you all is that CS is kind of one of those few bachelor's degrees that are just incredibly marketable right out of the gate. And I will go so far as to say that in terms of job and career prospects, there is almost no advantage to doing a master's degree over just having a bachelor's. And in fact, most like hiring managers at tech companies will tell you that they will take somebody with a BS and 2 or 3 years of software development experience at a major tech company over somebody with a master's in CS and no relevant job experience. And I would even go so far as to say, like, I can tell you most of my peers who kind of went through the hiring process after getting a master's were applying for pretty much the same type of software engineering, software development type jobs that most of you guys are going for as well. And that sort of sets up a very interesting thing, I think, that's unique to CS, which is that when you look at like the breakdown of, for instance, domestic versus international students in disciplines, CS, I believe, is one of, if not the most heavily skewed towards international students. And the reason for that simply is that there isn't really, from a career perspective, a compelling reason to do a master's in CS, unless one of two things. Either if you're an international student, you sort of come to the US for grad school to kind of get on the H-1B sort of pipeline and get sort of on the hiring track that way. Or you're somebody like me who didn't come from a CS background, didn't do a bachelor's in CS, and are now going back to school at the graduate level to try and kind of scrape together that domain experience that I didn't have previously. So I guess that's notable, bachelor's to master's. You're right to then say PhD, though, there is a notable difference. You know, PhDs are typically being hired in the research and development space. So if you want to be doing sort of like cutting edge machine learning, not just basic data science type, you know, plug and chug type stuff, but like really like developing new cutting edge systems, software, learning models, you need a PhD in the domain to do. So there is a significant difference between bachelor's and PhD. But yeah, hope that helps. So, and again, you know, the thing to emphasize with this is there is, I think, an emphasis on the company that you land in but really and realistically, that even within companies, the teams that you get hired onto, the projects that you get hired on, and those environments are really, really much more impactful towards your overall well-being. And so, again, I do, to whatever extent possible, recommend that you kind of go through the exercise and try to really sort of self-assess the environments where you would thrive in a position like that. And then sort of once you've hopefully kind of gone through that exercise, and it's an ongoing one, it's not something that like I'll tell you, like even for myself, I've noticed how my own preferences have evolved as I've grown and matured, and as like I have family responsibilities now, and that's kind of changed a lot of my priorities too. So it is worth noting that like those aren't sort of fixed positions. Those are things that change over time, but again, it is worth being aware of that. Beyond that, I think it's worth taking stock of your personal goals. Where do you want to live? And to me, like, I'll be honest with you, this is one of the things that sort of consistently shocks me when I'm talking to peers. Like we'll be talking about, where are you interviewing for jobs? And they'll be like, oh yeah, Seattle, the Bay Area, something here in LA. Maybe a few of them are looking at places in New York. And I'll be like, well, where do you want to live? And they're like, wherever I get a good offer, I'll go. And to me, that's such a counterintuitive approach to that and counterproductive approach to that, because where you live is so impactful on your well-being. And the simple reality is, the place where you get hired, chances are, if you're not in a significant relationship, that's where you're going to meet a significant other. Chances are that's where you're going to settle down. Before you know it, in the blink of an eye, 10 years will go by and you'll have been stuck in that place. And so if you don't like it, you have just consigned yourself to a decade or more. And let me tell you, when you're balancing not one career, but two careers, it can be very hard to move at that point. Going back to school is also kind of an important consideration as well. I always kind of knew in the back of my head that I potentially wanted to go back, either for some kind of technical degree, maybe for a PhD, and understanding companies' sort of association with that. Like, one of the things I loved about my company was that they were very generous about education support. They offered you time to do it. They reimbursed you for tuition. They were really supportive of me doing advanced degrees. If that's something that you might see in your future, it's important to take stock of that. Living abroad, traveling significantly. One of the hugest things for me as well was my company was very flexible about work-life arrangements. And I actually became a teleworker 7 years ago. And that's allowed me to live really across the globe while still working in that job and earning that paycheck. That was huge for me. So, if that's something that's potentially important for you, it's important to kind of, when you're scouting out these jobs, see to what extent those are important. Taking stock of your professional goals as well, understanding where you want to prioritize. Do you want to prioritize a work-life balance? Do you want to prioritize income maximization? Do you want to prioritize doing impactful work? Is it important to you that, the work that you do make a difference? And I think kind of one of the key points is, not only is this important in terms of maybe targeting your outreach and sort of job application focuses, but like, I can't tell you the number of people that I've talked to who, have gone through the process that you guys are going through right now, have done the leak coding, the technical interviews, the multiple rounds, right? Have gone through all that stress and then have landed a job. And then I'll be talking to them 6 months later and they'll be back on the job market because they just hate where they landed. And, so doing, not just jumping at the first kind of offer, not just kind of going with whoever gives you an offer, it could save you a significant amount of heartburn downstream if you end up in a space where you're not happy, because you really don't want to be doing this again a year from now. So all that, I guess, is by way of like trying to help sort of think about where you might thrive. So let's talk about kind of, once you have that knowledge, how would you apply that? Okay, you up until now, you've just been applying everywhere. Well, now maybe you can try to sort of narrow a list. Maybe you can try to target in some areas. So once you've narrowed your criteria, begin doing your research, talk to friends, ask mentors, professors, do research online, start making a list of companies that you could potentially kind of work in and thrive in, and then start tracking those. One other thing I'm going to mention when you apply, and this is kind of an important lesson that I learned, and it's one thing that I've leveraged successfully, but when you are applying, it often pays to be different. And this was just one example. I used this as a meme last time, and I thought it was just like a great example. Okay, software engineering intern, right? This thing posted 16 hours ago, almost 3,700 applicants in that time. And of those, even 1%, even 10% of those are highly qualified. You're looking at over 300 applicants that are highly qualified. If you're in that grind, how do you kind of stand out from that? How do you, you've worked hard, you're talented, you're a skilled software engineer, right? You've taken your coursework at UCLA. How on earth do you stand out of a pool of nearly 3,700 applicants? And so one kind of trick to do this is not necessarily applying to the positions that you're most qualified for, particularly early stage career, because at this point, it's not a strike against you guys, but the reality is the vast majority of your experience is academic, it's schoolwork, and as a result, it's pretty interchangeable from your peers. You don't have the domain-specific knowledge, you don't yet have kind of the unique set of skills and experiences to really sort of allow you to differentiate yourself based solely on your experiences. So, it can be very hard, no matter how qualified you are, to stand out when you're going up against fellow CS undergrads, not only from UCLA, but USC and Berkeley and University of Washington and UT Austin, right? When you're kind of going up against this sort of batch of incredibly highly qualified BS in CS students in terms of differentiating yourself. So one thing to think about is, particularly when you're thinking about industries you want to work about, is finding spaces where your skill sets are unique, where you as a CS major, you with your experiences are unique. And I mention that because you would be amazed at those results. And I can give you some examples of this. I can give you, so I did my master's at Carnegie Mellon, and my roommate at the time, kind of like an amazing story. He was, he was a researcher at the Human Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon. But the interesting kind of thing about him was he had never taken a software development, any programming CS courses. He had never taken any kind of technical skills. What he did have was he was a photojournalist. He had been a combat photographer. He had, prior to sort of coming to Carnegie Mellon, he had done just an immense amount of field work in photography. And at the time, I mean, still to this day, but this was back in 2010. This was like a decade ago. Computer vision was just a huge, huge challenge. Still is, but like back then it was the vogue. It was the problem. And, sitting at Carnegie Mellon, you had literally rooms and rooms full of machine learning, computer science, and specialists, but you didn't have a single individual that kind of came at it from a photography standpoint, that could look at a photograph and say, here is what is important to you when looking at a photograph. Here is what you need to look for. Here's what you need, here's what makes a photograph great. Here's the image composition. Here's the things. He brought that to the table. And that's how he landed that position. He was the only one in the room who had that experience. And, long story short, he worked at Carnegie Mellon for a few years, got technical background, and ended up doing his PhD in computer science at the University of Chicago. My own story, frankly, to UCLA is very similar. For those of you who know, my degree was in healthcare policy and management. I had never taken a CS course prior to starting at UCLA. But what I had was I worked for a company that was doing sort of healthcare and systems engineering work for the federal government. And I had I didn't have experience in CS, but I had tons of experience in terms of interfacing sort of new technology and research with government agencies. And I was able to leverage that. I went to the professor who gave my PI and I said, look, these are some research areas of interest to agencies like the Department of Defense, like the VA. I have those contacts. I have those, I have that experience. And we can kind of network that and leverage UCLA's strengths in research and prototyping and things with those connection interfaces. And long story short, I was accepted into the program, even though if you compare my resume and my skill sets, I was vastly underqualified to do graduate work in computer science. So again, something to think about when you're thinking about sort of career moves and pivots that you can do. Sometimes making those jumps, non-intuitive jumps, may be sort of can kind of allow you to leapfrog a lot of your careers and maybe kind of get you to sort of a level that you wouldn't necessarily expect you'd be able to walk into just with your raw experiences. Okay, landing the interview. So you found the company, you found the job that you want. How on earth do you get past the thousands of resumes and the application screenings and things like that? The long and the short of it is networking. And I am sure you have all heard about networking. I'm sure that has been drilled into your skull at this point. You must network, you must network, you must network. And what on earth does that mean? Does that mean showing up to a career fair in your best suit and tie and shake hands with the recruiter and try in the 60 seconds that you have to make an impression? Is that what networking looks like? How on earth does one network? And I'll be honest with you, nobody ever sort of sat me down and explained this to me. And it was kind of something that I stumbled into and I learned in watching other people, but like, it's so important and something that just people don't bother to tell you about. What does it actually mean to network? So here's, I think, sort of reframing the problem a little bit and kind of asking yourself this. Right now, you are an undergraduate. Maybe you've done a few side hustles. Maybe you've done some internships. But the reality is, and not as smacking as you, but there's not a whole lot. Why would somebody who's an industry professional with years of experience want to meaningfully network with you, right? It makes sense when you've been in the industry for decades, when you have a Rolodex of connections, when you have all of these real world experiences and things that you can kind of do, why they would want to network with you. But right now, what on earth do you have to bring to the table? And that's really kind of the goal, right? The goal of networking ultimately is developing meaningful relationships with people who can subsequently open doors for you. The people that you can sort of email, you can call, you can say, hey, do you know of any openings at Google? Do you know of any things? Hey, there's a position I'm interested in. Is there a chance you could get me in touch with the hiring manager for that? Right? That's ultimately the goal of networking. How do you do that? The answer, the trick to doing that is an informational interview. And I'm just going to pause here. Has anybody here done an informational interview before? Okay, I'm seeing one year on the chat. Anybody else done any informational interviews? Okay, I'm seeing a couple. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, an informational interview it's essentially it's a informal conversation you have with somebody, typically a superior, typically somebody with a little bit more experience, where your goal, you don't have a specific goal beyond just getting more understanding about their job and the work that they do. It's a chance for you to have a conversation with them, for them to kind of provide you with career advice. And there are a number of advantages to taking this approach. The first and foremost, frankly, it's an incredibly low pressure ask. You're not asking these people out of the blue for a job. You're not asking them for a referral. You're not asking them for anything beyond just kind of a chance to allow them to talk about their experiences and give you advice. Also, because it's so informal, it gives you an opportunity to create sort of a more friendly and interactive relationship with them. It allows you to build, I wouldn't necessarily say a friendship, but allows you to build a meaningful relationship with them, more than just somebody who's an email at the other end. The final reason why this is so important, and I think some people were kind of asking, going back to like what job, how to know what jobs will work for you. Informational interviews are probably some of the best ways to kind of short circuit and figure out what types of jobs and industries you would thrive in. It's a really easy, quick educational way to find out whether or not you would thrive in a particular environment just by talking to them and understanding the actual nature of their work. So let's talk about sort of informational interviews. Let's talk about sort of how you make the ask. So the first thing, be concise. There's no need for long-winded emails. These people tend to be very busy. They don't want to read a 5-page dissertation on your life. Concision is key. Provide only essential context, make a clear ask. Don't be open-ended. That's also an important thing. Oftentimes, people will sort of reflexively back away from an open-ended engagement. So make a very clear ask on what you're doing for. Scope your ask appropriately. Don't overreach it. Oftentimes, another important thing is having a fallback. So, this is sort of a classic negotiating tactic. But when you make your initial ask, if for whatever reason they're unable to comply with it, it's good to have a fallback so that even if they can't give you A, they can give you B. And then just follow through with it. Be consistent. This has happened multiple times where somebody has actually reached out to me to do an informational interview. I've replied and then just not gotten a response from them, or they've ghosted me on it. So it wouldn't be something you would think you'd have to say, but you surprisingly do. So here's just an example of what a cold call letter might look like. And, and again, here's just kind of some key examples of this. So start off by saying, where do I know you from? Where am I emailing you? How have I gotten your contact information? In what capacity am I reaching out to you? What role is relevant to me? Very briefly, who I am. What is the specific, the specific interest? Why am I messaging? Then what is the specific ask? I'm going to kind of call this out in particular. This is something that I like to do in particular, is I like specifically asking for 20-minute phone calls. And that's, I guess, just sort of a social psych type experiment where 20 minutes is long enough for a substantive conversation, but because it's less than a half hour, it doesn't feel like it's a significant commitment. So I kind of like framing it that way. And then finally, the fallback ask, right? Saying like, if they're unable to talk with you directly, is there anyone else they could recommend to me? Is there anyone else they could sort of point me to? And then sending it that way. When you get to your informational interview, I have sort of a list of questions that you can ask. And by the way, I did throw this up on my website. So if you want it, you can kind of reference this if this will be helpful. But again, these are just super, super helpful kind of just questions, just to not only for you to sort of build the relationship with them, but also for you to learn as much as you can about the domain. And then finally, when you do it, be sure to follow through with them. Do send them a note, thanking them. Request if you can that you can kind of stay in touch with them. That's another big thing. Just say like, oh, as my, as this is continuing to unfold and I'm beginning to apply for jobs, can I follow up with you just to like keep you informed of how things are going? And this is another thing that I think is like a really nice gesture, buying them a coffee. As you guys have probably noticed, I am a fan of the $5 Starbucks gift card. I think it's just like a perfect way to sort of show gratitude and appreciation without necessarily overdoing it, just saying you appreciate your time, you appreciate that they did it. And I will tell you, it works. I've been on the flip side of that where I did a interview with somebody and they sort of came back to me, got me just a small token of appreciation. I remembered that. And a year later, we had a chance to hire them for something and they were the first person I reached out to. Finally, when it comes time to sort of follow up and apply, do follow up with them to get a referral, because at that point, they know you, you have a relationship, they've talked to you. Hopefully you're on friendly terms and they're going to feel a lot more comfortable referring you to positions or opening you up to sort of meeting people and doing referrals. So let me kind of pause there and see if anybody has any questions specifically about sort of that process of networking and interviewing. Well, I not so subtly eat my food. And by the way, I can attest to it. Like it seems gimmicky, but it really does work. It is an incredibly effective way for you to make really meaningful connections with people at companies that you're interested in working in, people in disciplines that you're interested in doing. It's just an incredibly empowering way to do it. And I will also note that there's a number of kind of good ways of doing this. LinkedIn is an obvious way to sort of do outreach, but frankly, another way to do it is looking at your extended social network. So friends and colleagues of your parents, sort of peers at UCLA who maybe graduated a few years ahead of you, just kind of tapping your extended network can be really, really useful for this. And precisely because this is an informational interview, it's a much less awkward ask than going to your parents' friend and saying, hey, can you get me a job, right? It's going to them and saying, can I get an informational interview? Can I talk to you about your career and understand kind of the ups and downs of working in management consulting or investment banking or something like that. It's a much easier, much better ask. And frankly, it really does yield much better results in terms of actually building meaningful relationships with people.
Question about the talking process.
Mm-hmm.
So as you can see in Zoom classes, it is sometimes very difficult to get the ball rolling when you begin. And after a year of it, I don't think any of us have really gotten that down. Any advice?
Yeah, so definitely coming prepared is important. There is being a good interviewer, being a good discussion facilitator is important. And the good news with an informational interview is they're the ones who are supposed to be doing the talking, not you. They're the ones, and unsurprisingly, most people do like talking about themselves. Let me put you in that shoes, for instance. Imagine for a moment that a high school senior reached out to you and said, they're a potential college applicant. They want to apply to UCLA. They would love to hear about your experiences as a student at UCLA and what you would recommend to them. Right? How many of you would jump at the opportunity to spend 20 minutes talking with them? If they came to you and asked you that. Now, if you think about it, you probably realize, right? You'd be like, hey, I've learned a lot. Unsurprised, like I've been bruised and beaten and down the road of the core system, and I can impart my wisdom upon all the youth of tomorrow. And so they'll be in the exact same position. And so I think the important thing for that is just come prepared to be able to facilitate that conversation. And again, here's some just kind of questions that you can come prepared with, like things like, can you tell me about your career path? How did you end up here? What were some of your earlier roles? More generally, what have you found to be challenges and opportunities working in your industry? Describe, like, what does a typical workday look like for you? What sort of skill sets in general are in high demand in your company? What can I be doing now to make myself a more competitive candidate in a year or two when I'm ready to apply? Things like that. And again, most people would be super, super happy to just talk to that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but your job is really to just kind of facilitate them talking. So I will call out this thing here. Any recommendations for other people or other resources I should explore? That's also a really, really useful question to ask, precisely because them making introductions on your behalf can be so helpful for you as part of a conversation. They can be an entry point, but they can open so many doors to you in terms of other people to talk to. So I would definitely highlight that. And I can tell you, like, I know somebody last quarter was kind of in a position where she was feeling like really, really down in the dumps. She had kind of gone through a process of applying to a bunch of internships and wasn't really getting any callbacks and was just really not doing this. And then she kind of embraced doing this and like really went hardcore at it, like went multiple informational interviews, and it just kind of dramatically transformed her outlook. Like, you know, we were talking afterwards and she was saying how she had completely changed her perspective on what type of career she wanted to be in. She had had so many useful conversations, and it had resulted in a number of leads. And even she ended up getting an internship offer just based on those conversations. So, yeah, I really do want to emphasize that it is such an important tool in your arsenal that you have available to you. Any other questions? So another thing to note is there is kind of this mismatch between almost every company is actively looking for talent. They're actively looking to hire. They want qualified candidates. And yet you are applying anywhere and you cannot get interviews anywhere to save your life. And I'm going to be honest with you, a really, really important way to sort of sidestep the whole HR black hole where your resumes go to die is an internal referral. It makes a huge difference having an employee submit you to an internal system. Every major company has this. And by the way, spoiler alert, employees are almost always compensated for successful referral. That's true in my company as well. You know, if I refer a candidate that gets hired, I get a cash bonus for doing it. So unsurprisingly, employees are totally willing and eager to actually refer you. It's just about making those connections. So I do see a question about grades or GPA. I will talk about that in a little bit. Spoiler alert, it doesn't matter at all. I know you guys have busted your proverbial balls to get a great GPA, and it is just never of interest, unless the only way it matters is from a grad school perspective. If you're going back to school, if you want to go back to school, then it matters. Otherwise, it just, they don't care. There's a ton of information out there about how to properly structure and tailor your resume. So I'm not going to dwell on that. There's just so much stuff out there about that, but just, you know, how to frame it intelligently, talking about sort of specific bullet points of things that you did, your outcomes, all that's out there. If you have any questions, we can talk about that, but I think you just Google resume tips and that's there. So you got the interview. It's time for you to kind of nail it. Obviously at this point, I'm assuming you are all intimately familiar with LeetCode. It really, really does matter. And the thing, and again, you're going to see this people talk about, it is important. It's important for you to practice whiteboarding with friends. It's important for, it is deeply important for you to kind of, it's a skill set to be able to get up in front of an audience and explain technical concepts and work through problems. And it's something you're not necessarily natively good at, but it's something that you can practice and you can get better at. And practicing is really, really important. It's not enough to know the material. It's important that you practice how to do it as well. So, you know, that's the one thing that I would emphasize with that. Another thing that I would sort of mention about this is practicing your answers also really, really makes a difference. If you're nervous about interviewing, you know, let's face it, it is a nerve-wracking experience. Just do it as early and often as you can. Try to, you know, and actually this is sort of a good tip that I got from this. If you have a number of interviews coming up, it's not a bad idea to do the lower priority ones first. Just get better at it. And after you interview, another really, really good habit to get into is writing out the questions you were asked. Just document the questions you were asked and work through them. Because oftentimes what you'll find is in the moment, you may struggle to come up with the right words. You may, you know, there may be a point that you could have made that you missed, But if you write it down and afterwards, like literally when you're in the shower, just thinking through it, you can oftentimes come up with a much more polished approach to it. Do that, work on it, work on those responses so that the next time you get it, you have it ready to go. Practice really does make perfect. The other thing that I think is really, really important, and this was something that I struggled with for a number of years, is learning how to talk about yourself. And people, and you always hear like, you are your own best salesman, and you got to talk yourself up. But I think if you're like me, a lot of it is just looking at being like, how do I just sit there and brag about myself and not sound like a complete asshole? And how do I literally sell myself without being just a conceited idiot? And I think in watching what other people did and the people that were really good at doing this, one trick that I realized that they did was rather than talking about themselves, they were really good at talking about what excited them and getting people interested in the things that interested them. And because, let's face it, it may be difficult for you to sit there and talk about why you're such an awesome person. But if you think about the things that excite you, you would probably have no problem just ranting and raving about those. And so if as part of an interview, you can kind of make the discussion about the things that excite you, and in turn, if you can kind of get the people around you drawn in and excited about that, by, reference, they will also become excited about you. So learn to talk about your passions. Don't learn to talk about yourself, talk about your passions, talk about what excites you. And like everything else, practice it, write it out, rehearse it, test drive it, be able to sort of talk about this to, the type of stuff that you're doing to completely non-technical people, your friends and family, your parents, like people who have never coded a day in their life. Can you explain what you do in a really interesting and dynamic way? Can you explain it to people who are technical but not necessarily CS people? And can you explain it to CS professionals? So this is going back to, I guess, questions around like GPA and whatnot. I'll be honest with you, I'm not going to say never, 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 but outside of an academic position, I have never seen somebody get asked for their transcript. Again, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I haven't seen it being done. In terms of like highly specialized quantitative positions, they will do technical interviews to assess your technical domain expertise. It is far more important that you ace a technical interview than that you got an A in software development. If they want to hire you for a technical role, they will give you technical specific exercises for you to solve. The other thing that I will be perfectly blunt about is that while your GPA does not matter, side hustles matter tremendously. It really, when you're on an interview, those little hackathons you attended, those projects that you launched in your dorm room, the research you did with a professor, those are the things that allow you to stand out. They allow you to demonstrate real technical competence. They allow you to sort of talk about your passions, and they kind of allow you to cheat a little bit on the experience thing as well. You're coming out of undergrad, you technically don't have working experience, but if you can show that you were the CTO for a startup launched out of UCLA, and you did the full stack development for it, and you got to the point where it was accepted into an incubator or whatnot, right? Like that's impressive, and that's something that will matter. So I know it kind of feels counterproductive because you're spending so much time in your coursework, but the reality is when it comes to interviews, these side hustles really, really make a difference. And I can tell you that when I went to my own interview, nobody talked to me about my coursework, but I happened to have had some really interesting research experiences. And I happened to have been working on a startup at the time and had worked on some past things. And with that, I was able to just talk to that. And that was the substance of the interviews. So you know, for better or for worse, having those side hustles really, really make a difference. So the final thing I wanted to talk about is when you actually do get your offer. You know, so you go through the process, you've gone multiple rounds, they give you an offer, story over, right? You know, now you accept it, everything's good. Well, good news is there is room for negotiation. And I do kind of want to mention this because I think a lot of people sort of coming out into their first thing don't necessarily know sort of the flexibility when it comes to that. But the reality is, once you have gotten an offer, things do shift a little bit. It's not, you know, you can't ask for the moon, but at that point, you're in a little bit of a power position. They have indicated they want you. They've indicated they want to work with you. And sometimes there's room for you to be flexible. So, you know, and these are generally some parameters that you can kind of come back and try to ask for. The most obvious thing is to see whether or not they'd be willing to move up on your salary. Another thing is sometimes hiring departments, you know, because there's a number of reasons like departments will tier their hiring levels or things like that. So they won't necessarily be flexible in terms of their salary, but you may be able to ask them for things like a relocation package if you're moving out of town. You know, they may have some discretionary spending to kind of help out with that. One other ask that I think is really, really useful that a lot of people don't necessarily know to make is asking for an accelerated review cycle. So a lot of people will say, you know, just hiring, we can't go above, let's say 75K as a starting offer for you know, newly hired people. But you can come in and say, well, if you do your annual reviews every year, once a year, is there a way that I can get an accelerated review and be considered for a raise / promotion in 6 months rather than a year? Oftentimes they'll be very open to doing that. But one thing to note, very important to get that in writing. It's very easy for a hiring manager to say, sure, we'll reevaluate in 6 months, and then just kind of ghost you when it comes time to it. Do get that offer in writing. So competing offers is always, so there's a good question in the chat about competing offers. That's always a little bit of a tricky thing. But yes, you know, you can be upfront about, you know, having competing offers. You need to be a little tactful about doing it, but it's okay to acknowledge that you are fielding an alternative offer, and maybe that alternative offer has, you know, a higher salary range than this one had been. It's, you know, at the end of the day, if they would be turned off by something like that, which frankly is a very straightforward move, then frankly that's probably a company that's manipulative and underhanded and probably wouldn't be a company you'd want to work for anyway. So I think it's fine, but having said that, don't put yourself into a position where you box yourself into a corner and you say, well, you know, you're offering me 75, this other company's offering me 80. I don't think I can take 80. And then they say, well, 75 is the best I don't think I can take 75, but and then, you know, and they say, well, we can't budge on that. And you're like, okay, well, I've talked myself out of this offer, right? You know, do try to be careful about that. Sometimes there can be wiggle room with benefits. That's another thing that you can kind of explore. See whether or not, you know, there are more generous offers for retirement matching, paid time off, you know, can be flexible in the amount of paid time off they give you. Oftentimes these are fixed. Generally, benefits are corporate wide, but you never know. And it's always worth asking. A final thing, this lifestyle thing is probably the area in which you have the most latitude. You know, and again, this just ties back to sort of original priorities. Things like flexible working environments, work from home, delaying your start date to give you a little bit more time. Those are areas in which, generally speaking, hiring managers have the most latitude, and you should definitely see if you can't work out a more favorable arrangement in that domain. So that is typically the area in which you can get kind of the highest bang for your buck. So that's what I had for career talk. let me open it up. What, I mean, any questions? Anything that I tried to answer things in the chat as they came up, but like anything I missed? There's a question about leak code practice is more like memorizing because you won't be able to remember all to solve one problem. Any thought? Yeah, so Ricky's response in the chat, I think is appropriate for that. You know, the thing about getting good at leak code is getting good at solving those types of problems, recognizing that they tend to be structured in a certain way and just kind of getting good at rapidly scripting an answer. It's not about memorizing 1,000 different permutations of a question, but just understanding how that question is asked and generally speaking, how to frame a response and how to script up a solution really quickly. So I think it's just about sort of getting a familiarity with getting good, right? It's just like if you think about how you study for an aptitude exam, you don't memorize 1,000 different SAT questions, but you do familiarize yourself with the type of question and you practice getting good at answering it so that when you do see it, it's kind of something that kicks in with muscle memory. So there's a question in China, how much money you should ask for. You can definitely do, definitely do your research. Things like Glassdoor are really, really good, really useful for that purpose. Come in with industry benchmarks if you can. What would you expect somebody with your degree of experience getting hired to this job to have? That's not a hard figure to look up, and you can definitely find that. The thing you also sort of need to adjust with that is oftentimes there are cost of living adjustments depending on what market you're in. So a salary that you were offered in San Francisco will be very different than one that you're offered in Tulsa, Oklahoma, just because of cost of living. So that is something to factor in when you're thinking about what an appropriate compensation level is. But yeah, there's tons of resources out there for you to look up and to see. And it's definitely worth coming in prepared with that information. Even better if you have a competing offer, because then it's not an abstract conversation. You could say, look, I have, I really want to work with you guys. I love the work you're doing, but I have an offer that's coming in $10,000 higher than yours. If we can't even come close to that, then I don't know that I'll be able to accept this. So it definitely helps to have a competing offer. Any other questions? Okay, well, I hope that was helpful, guys. Again, I don't know how much of that was novel information for you, how much of that is stuff that you've heard before. I don't know how much of it would be practical to you, but I do hope it's helpful. Like I said, I did try to kind of frame this in terms of things I wish I had been told in your position. But yeah, and I guess I'll stay on for a bit just to kind of see if you have any other questions, project, course, anything related. But I just want to acknowledge and just kind of take a moment to thank you guys all for participating and being involved and engaged. This has been such an incredibly difficult and challenging quarter. And just acknowledging that the effort that you all have put in. I think it is really underappreciated, the amount of psychological toll that this prolonged experience has had. I mentioned this early on, but the reality is college, even at the best of times, is an incredibly stressful situation. And that's when you still have all of the perks of college, of late nights and seeing your friends and doing all that. And, this is just kind of taken all the awful, crappy, and miserating parts of college and stripped out everything that made it bearable and fun. And it has been absolute torture for you all. And I just kind of really want to acknowledge you guys for pulling through. It's remarkable that you guys have been able to kind of hang in there and just know that, like, it's okay to not be okay in this space. This is not a normal acceptable time frame, and it's, you know, you're not alone for going through what you're going through. And so just to kind of acknowledge that and just acknowledge all of you for pulling through, because I think if I was in your shoes, I don't think I would have been able to persevere to the extent that you all have. So yeah, so with that, again, I want to thank you guys all for an amazing quarter, and I will stop recording, and then we'll just kind of chat some more projects, life, jobs, whatever's on your mind.